Welcome to the Brookline League of Women Voters Forum on Affordable Housing. Tonight we will hear several presentations, followed by questions and answers. But first, a brief overview. Brookline is committed to providing housing for a diverse community, ethnically, culturally, and economically, while respecting our neighborhoods. Accomplishing all these goals can be challenging, even more so in a built-out community. And today, Brookline faces the intense pressure in metropolitan Boston to increase both market and affordable housing. In 1980, a nonprofit community development organization, the Brookline Improvement Coalition, or BIC, was established to support affordable housing. Sarah K. Wallace, who is the BIC's founding clerk, was also a founder of the Brookline League of Women Voters. In 1996, BIC renovated 16 affordable lodging house units, now managed by Pine Street Inn, at 1017 Beacon Street, and named the building Sarah Wallace House in her honor. BIC also owns an apartment building with 6 affordable units. A few years later, Pine Street Inn partnered with BIC to renovate another 14 units at 1754 Beacon Street, opened in 2003, which won a preservation award from the Massachusetts Historical Commission. More recently, in partnership with the Catholic Archdiocese Planning Office for Urban Affairs, a mixed-income, friendly 40B project at the former St. Aidan's Church, with 36 affordable units, was completed in 2009. In 2012, working with a private developer, 24 affordable condominium units were constructed along with 8 previously built single-family homes in a mixed-income project on town-owned property at Olmsted Hill. The Brookline Housing Authority built the town's first permanently affordable housing for veterans in 1947 after World War II, and since then has added many units for families, seniors, and people with disabilities. The most recent are 32 brand new units on Drummer Street that are in the process of being occupied, with priority for Brookline residents. Not far behind, Pine Street Inn is working on completing renovation of 31 enhanced lodging houses on Beale Street. All of these projects were local initiatives developed by mission-driven nonprofits or by the town and have only been possible with careful planning and multiple funding sources, including the Brookline Housing Trust and state and federal programs. Currently, there are 3 privately developed 40B housing projects in the pipeline. 64 units are under construction at 45 Marion Street. Hancock Village has been approved for 161 units, and 21 Crown and Shield Road is in process. These could add another 35 to 40 affordable units. Now, where do we go from here? Tonight, we are fortunate to have 4 panelists who have a broad range of knowledge and experience in the creation and operation of affordable housing. We will hear from Bill Rylett, State Administrator for Chapter 40R, Smart Growth Zoning, or Transit-Oriented Development, who will talk about some new approaches. Then, from Roger Blood, Chair of the Brookline Housing Advisory Board, who will discuss affordable housing goals, inclusionary housing, and the complexities of financing. He will be followed by Jan Griffin, Director of Planning, Pine Street Inn, who will talk about creating housing for the very low income or homeless, who also may need services. And last but not least, David Traish, Chair of the Brookline Housing Authority, will wrap up with comments about the variety of housings provided by BHA and the increasingly affordable gap. Unfortunately, the first part of Mr. Rylett's presentation was not recorded due to technical problems.
Review the zoning, we issue a letter of eligibility, provided the zoning meets all the requirements and the district location is eligible. The community adopts the zoning, and then it comes back to us for just verification that it actually is consistent with what we had approved as eligible, and then we issue a letter of approval, and at that point applicants can begin proposing projects within the district. Just quickly, that's sort of the distribution of existing districts to date. We have 36 districts, very soon to be 39. This slide here shows you the size. Those numbers in red are the size of the districts, or at least the net new units in the district. We have zoned over almost 13,000 units have been zoned, and around 2,900 are built or in construction. Those communities that are listed are shown in green are the districts that have produced units at this point, and we have 3 currently eligible or pending districts. This shows you some of the funds that have been received by communities that have been participating so far. The 3 communities that are in red are communities that have taken advantage of, the red rectangle around them are communities that have taken advantage of the Chapter 40S, the school cost reimbursement. So the number you see there is the combined 40R and 40S payments. And just quickly, a couple of examples. This is a small district in Belmont, and you can see the graphic there on the right shows you can have different sub-districts that have different characteristics. I'm realizing that I sort of skipped over the density allowances, which are 20 units an acre, and this is what the zoning must allow on the developable or underutilized parcels. So not necessarily every parcel in the district. Must allow, if you zone for multifamily, you need to allow at least 20 units an acre. Does not have to be built to that threshold, but has to allow for it. 8 units an acre for single family and 13 units an acre for 2 or 3 family. Sorry, that was Reading. This was a former grocery store site there near the train station. Was vacant at the time and redeveloped into a 4-story mixed-use building with ground floor retail. This is Northampton, Village Hill, an old state hospital site, which does not occupy that whole area shown. We had Ted Tye from National Development, for those who attended the, was that Monday night? Yeah. The Route 9 presentation, he was one of the panelists. This is National Development's Arbor Point at Market Street up in Linfield, which was proposed as sort of actual vertical, mixed use, but ultimately was developed as sort of a residential development next to a so-called lifestyle center. And that's it. I don't know how I did in terms of time there, but.
I think you're doing very well indeed. And I would even say, just because what you presented is a lot of data that probably is new. I should speak into the microphone. Maybe what we might do right now is, if there are any questions, just that are fact-based, based on this presentation. Otherwise, we'll go forward. We're going to have plenty of opportunity for questions later. But is there anything that you are confused about or didn't understand in this part of our presentation? Okay, we'll move right along. Now, yes, we have to do the technical thing. And you could take yours away.
Yeah.
And then Roger's not going to use this.
Okay. Close up yours too.
No, well, Jan, yes, you can close mine. I have to be able to get back to it for Jan. I don't know where it is now. Okay. Roger Blood. What happened to Roger? There you are. Sorry. Okay, so now we're going to hear something that is a little more Brookline specific. Mr. Blood.
Thank you, Betsy. First of all, thanks to the League, not just for this particular session tonight, but for adopting, I think for the year, the better part of the year, the topic of affordable housing. This is the second of several sessions, and that's great for those of us that are especially interested in affordable housing and advancing ideas in this area here in Brookline. It's a particularly interesting time right now. I think that the town is in a really a transition and facing some challenges that we haven't had before up until now. And so I hope in not only the brief period I'm going to make some remarks, but especially in the Q&A that follows, that you'll find some food for thought from the four of us really on this subject. 10%. If I say that number, probably most of you know what I'm leading toward. The town adopted this goal of having 10% of our total housing as officially affordable at least a decade ago in our 2005 comp plan. And for the last 10 years or more, there it's set, 10% we've been at 8, a little more than 8 maybe, and something like 500 units short of 2,600 units of affordable, 10% of 26,000, which is the whole town's housing stock. Why are we in a transition right now? Because up until now, it was pretty easy to give lip service to the 10%. It was almost impossible in most people's minds that reflected on it that we were going to get there in any realistic way. It was too costly. We didn't have enough land. Where in the world would Brookline find the subsidy resources and the sites, not to mention the will to do over 500 units of affordable housing? Things have changed in the last couple of years, where that 10% is now something that the events have kind of caught up with us, because the market has moved into a situation where we are now within striking distance of the 10% in the real marketplace. And the town is faced with the question of, are we going to do whatever we can to guide that process as best as we can, or will the market simply drive wherever it wants to go, and the state of Massachusetts behind them, overriding our local zoning as Chapter 40B can do, and allowing some things to happen and some scale of development that I think many of us would be not thrilled about as compared with things that we might have the ability to shape ourselves. We've been accustomed to shaping almost everything we've done in town up until this point. Following on a town meeting resolution in the spring town meeting, the Housing Advisory Board and the Planning Board have retained a consultant to do what's known as a housing production plan. This is something that the state prescribes, and communities are encouraged to adopt a more or less formal plan on how they are going to get from wherever they happen to be, from our 8 point something, closer to 9, 9 point something plus if Hancock Village were to materialize, to the 10%. And so we are going to be going through that process in the next 6 months, and look forward to not only a good professional help, but engagement with a lot of the interested parties in town, and then with the general public. And so you'll be seeing some of these well-publicized functions and exchanges to try and have the community not only understand the process and the need to get to the 10%, but to help decide on where and how and in what form the developments, the specific sites and developments will take place to get there. So this is going to be a challenge, because it's not just about numbers and production, for sure. There are some conflicting forces and really objectives that are going to be critical to us all along the way, and I'll just mention a few of them. Probably the main one is the need to achieve the housing production, and this is basically new housing, with our very strong feelings about our established residential neighborhoods, and retaining the character of those neighborhoods, and not allowing them to be inappropriately intruded upon by large-scale development. The second, I think that there's probably a lot of people in town that are very sincerely for affordable housing, but cautious about high density and large-scale development. So there's going to be those two forces may be something that needs to be reconciled as best as we can. And the market may want to drive us in one direction, and we may want to drive where these developments occur in a slightly different direction. And finally, I think just about everybody knows, on a lot of sites where there is potential for development, there are at least 3 major competing uses, and housing is one of the 3. And we're going to be needing to work those competing forces through between affordable housing advocates and the siting of our schools. And then as recently as a couple of nights ago, we had a great forum downstairs on economic development. And of course, there's the competing use for expanding the tax base with commercial development. One ideal opportunity is to find places where we can do mixed-use development that combines both commercial and housing. I would like to take just a few minutes, if that's kind of sets the stage for maybe some good discussion or Q&A at the end of this, to take a quick look at some of the capabilities that the town has now to draw upon as we try to achieve some of these goals. The Housing Division and the Housing Advisory Board, which works hand in hand with the division in the Planning Department, really came about with the transition from rent control over 20 years ago. And at that time, and David Treach, who's one of our fellow panelists here, was the godfather of a lot of this. The basic laws were set up for the HAB and the Housing Trust Fund to give us local resources to work with. And over that period of time, what maybe the most relevant today is not just look at what was done in the past, really a remarkable, I'll call it kind of a toolkit or a set of, a combination of skill sets backed up by resources are now at the ready. And it's remarkable in the sense because the Housing Division is really 2.5 people. And as I said, with the HAB citizen support. And I just want to run through these very quickly. I haven't had occasion to think about them in a while. We've got inclusionary zoning, which mandates developers of any size to make an affordable housing contribution, either in on-site units or money into the trust fund, money which has totaled over $10 million since the trust fund first began. We have the ability to do friendly 40Bs, such as St. Aidan's, which is, again, significant dollars, but also a skill set and the experience to come to the table and make a 40B work in a collaborative way. We've been through the process of disposing of town-owned property for the sake of achieving affordable housing goals, such as occurred up on Olmsted Hill. And Betsy DeWitt deserves years of credit and effort for bringing it to the point where people like the Housing Advisory Board could actually start looking at and negotiating the specifics. We've focused on lodging houses over the years, and you're going to hear Jan Griffin speak shortly about one a terrific partnership that the town has had that's been successful. A mission-driven sponsor partnering with the town and the town's trust fund to serve a particular group of needs and beneficiaries, which moves towards one of our goals, which is diverse beneficiaries. Another is the purchase and rehab of existing housing for affordable rentals. Betsy showed you the picture of 154, 156 Boylston Street, which was a good example of that. Another is the purchase of individual condominium units in market rate buildings and then attaching the deed restriction, reselling the unit in a lottery for permanent affordability. Not large volume, but another tool in the toolkit. 1600 Beacon Street up near Washington Square, a large apartment building, has several affordable units in it. We have 2 homeownership assistance, down payment assistance homeownership programs that have worked in small numbers over the years, but again, one more capability. One is down payment assistance for units where the unit is permanently deed restricted after being acquired. The other is something called a shared appreciation mortgage program, where the buyer gets access to an affordable unit, and the town's stake in that unit for the long term is that when it sells, the town gets a good share of the appreciation when the unit is sold. You've heard a bit about the preservation of existing units in expiring use buildings. The old Roger Stern buildings and Hebrew Rehab was a good earlier example that the town put $1 million in to keep units affordable. And more recently, the Juniper Street co-ops down in the village was done in the same way. One thing that many people aren't aware of, and it's a small program, but really very important. The town has a foreclosure prevention fund. Some of our trust fund monies have been set aside and earmarked in case an existing affordable owner faces foreclosure or distress. For example, one success in that area was a condominium on Winchester Street where there was a major renovation that raised the assessment so much that the affordable owner was unable to afford it, and we were able to save the owner's unit from foreclosure with a disbursement from this particular fund. The housing, just a couple more, and then I'll finish up. Our housing division operates a help desk, essentially, for anybody that has questions or needs or concerns about their own situation. It's not just providing affordable units, but referrals to all other kinds of housing resources and even social services. That particular activity is backstopped by a listserv of people who have put their names on a list of over 3,000 individuals and households who want to be notified by the town, by the housing division, when there's an opportunity or a lottery that might come up for an affordable housing situation that might meet their needs. The last two are, again, within the housing division more than the HAB, but the staff monitors all of the affordable housing in town. There was a lot of questions when the programs began whether we would be watchful to make sure that there weren't abuses or loss of affordability or anything like that over time, so that when units are resold that are affordable, they come back through the town, and individual units are requalified through a lottery that the town runs from time to time to make sure that the affordability continues for new owners. And finally, the housing division is very active with fair housing and works with the Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, which is, again, something that may tend to get forgotten or put on the side when we talk about affordable housing, but it's an extremely important activity. So I run those things off very quickly, only for the sake of, as we talk about how do we get to our goals, there is this wide range of toolkits that can be used as opportunities arise or as we create those opportunities for moving ahead.
Thanks very much, and I will have to say, over my career in public activities in Brookline and engagement with affordable housing, I would never have been able to come up with all of those programs, and I am totally amazed that they all exist. But it does somewhat illustrate, I think, the complicated, actually complexity of creating affordable housing, no matter how strongly you may want to have it. There are many, many different approaches, and some of them are going to work in one situation and not in another. So it's not as easy as it sounds. Now, okay. And here is our next speaker coming from a different and interesting perspective. So Jan Griffith, Pine Street Inn.
Thank you, Betsy. I just need one more moment of your time to know how to go to the next slide.
You push this.
Push that down.
Down. Yeah.
Very good, great. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Margaret. And thank you to the League for having this evening. I was thrilled when Betsy called me and asked me if I would come tonight and talk about Pine Street Inn's partnership. Oh, good, thank you. I was thrilled when Betsy called me and asked me if I would come tonight and talk about Pine Street Inn's partnership with the town of Brookline. So if you did not know that the Pine Street Inn had affordable housing here in Brookline, you might be asking, why? Why am I here? And why is there this partnership? And I'll tell you, it's for two basic reasons. And one is the same reason why you live here. Brookline is a wonderful community. It has amenities galore. It has fabulous, fabulous public transportation. And the housing stock is to die for. It's beautiful. It's, you know, and Betsy has already preempted me a little bit and shown some of our pictures, but it's a wonderful, beautiful, safe place to live. And that's reason number one, we're here. Reason number two is Brookline does not have an emergency shelter for people who become homeless in your town. So that's true of many towns and many cities. Chelsea doesn't have a shelter either. And so people in that situation, when they become homeless, seek out an emergency shelter like Pine Street. Not always at Pine Street, maybe the City of Boston shelter, different shelters. But last year, we had 19 people come to the Pine Street Inn for shelter who were last housed in Brookline. So that's another piece of the partnership. We're here over in Boston to provide shelter when Brookline needs an emergency shelter bed for individuals. We only serve individuals, not families. So that's the why. Just a little trip down memory lane for me and Pine Street. So Pine Street was founded in 1969 on Pine Street in Chinatown. And in 1980, we moved to the south end of Boston in the iconic Boston Fire Headquarters building. And we quickly bought the building right next door and established 2 large shelters, one for men and one for women. In the late 1970s, the early 80s, when we first moved there in 1980, we had space galore. And in 1981, we had every bed filled and mats on the floor with people sleeping mat to mat in the lobby. So overnight. And the reason for that was deinstitutionalization was really, ramping up and going strong, and condo conversion. So the South End really was a lodging house district. And Brookline had a lot of lodging houses also. And the conversion of those buildings without proper relocation for the tenants who were there. And I've been at Pine Street a long time, over 20 years, and met people who just, the night before were in their lodging house, and the owner just said, I've sold it, you have to go. And people would leave because they didn't know they had rights around that. So those 2 big things caused the Pine Street Inn Board of Directors to take a big step backwards and say, what are we doing? Every year in the wintertime, we would set up temporary shelters in armories. We did it at the BU Armory, all different armories around Metro Boston. And we would bus people to those armories because winter was obviously a critical time of year. So are we going to keep doing this? Are we going to keep expanding shelter? Or are we going to solve the problem? So we took the giant step of buying our first lodging house in Brookline. So we've done a lot of firsts in Brookline. So we bought the lodging house, which is on the left-hand side, the top with the 2 green side-by-side doors at 1043, 1045 Beacon Street. And that was our foray into Brookline. That lodging house itself has 28 units, and as I said, it was our first building. Today, we have 39 buildings, all different shapes and sizes, and we also lease scattered site apartments, and all totaled, we have 900 units of affordable housing that the agency runs. Initially, when we got into this world, we had a continuum of care for people where you'd come to the Pine Street Inn, you'd get a shelter bed, our counselors would work with you, and we'd say, oh, we have this great transitional program, and you can stay here for 24 months, and we'll teach you all sorts of things, and you'll get clean and sober, and so on and so forth. And then we'll get you a housing unit. We don't do that anymore. The transitional piece is gone. And it's gone for many reasons, but most of all, it's a fast track into housing. If you're homeless today, there's no reason for you to stay in a shelter for months and months and months. If we can find you a unit and we have the support services to wrap around you, we want to get you out of the Pine Street Inn as soon as possible and into community-based housing. So today, no transitional programs. You go right from the shelter into housing. And let's see, success. So our vision, again, today, this wasn't our vision in 1969 at all, but our vision today is a permanent home and a community for everyone. And that's the trajectory that we are on. I just wanted to show you this piece quickly so that you can sort of know our, where we're going and why we're going. So, you know, the world, there's only so many pieces of pie. There's only so much money that goes around, right? So we need to figure out how to use the pie differently. We get funding from the federal government for rental subsidies. We get money from the state for shelter resources, and we get money from the state also for rental subsidies. So in 2002, the blue piece of that bar graph is the housing units, and the green part are the shelter beds. So in 2002, we had 715 shelter beds and 280 units of housing. Move down the chart, by fiscal year 2009, we're getting fairly even. We have 691 in terms of shelter bed and 513. Then, so all was well, we want to have more housing units than we have shelter beds. All was going along swimmingly until we merged with Hope Found, which was the Shattuck Shelter in 2012. And the Shattuck Shelter had 12 units of housing and 180 shelter beds. So then then we had to kind of recalibrate the chart. And so we stalled out for a little while there. And now, as you'll see down to the end on the right of the chart, we now have 905 units of housing and 670 shelter beds. As you'll see, the 670 is fairly static now. We are not able to take down shelter beds because the demand is so high. Earlier in 2003, 2004, we were shutting down shelter beds and using that money to support people in permanent housing. So we're hoping that things get better going forward, but right now we're a little stuck in our 670 shelter beds, needing to keep them up because the demand is so high. I just need a little drink of water. So this is our building on Beacon Street. When you think about supportive housing, it's basically a three-legged stool. We need capital, obviously, to acquire it and to renovate it. We need rental subsidies because the people that we serve in housing are extremely low income. They're well below 30% of the area median income. Some people come into our housing with no income at all, and then our case managers work with them to get them the income that they need, either a disability program, maybe a part-time job, something like that. But we do house people with zero income and then work to get them income. And the third leg of the stool is support services. The people who come to Pine Street, when they end up in our shelters, something has happened. For some people, it's a short episode, and they move quickly out of shelter and can be fine on their own. It was just, one problem in life. Many, many people, though, it was a long road into shelter, and then often it's a long road out of shelter. And some people need support long term. If people have mental health issues, if people have substance abuse issues, if people have both of those issues, our supportive housing is geared to support people so that they can have successful tenancies and become members of the community and succeed. Now, they might not be joining the neighborhood association tomorrow, which is sort of what I did as soon as I moved into my community. I thought, how can I get into this community? This is what I'll do. But the point is, we want people receiving services and knowing that they are a neighbor just like everyone else. They need to behave like a neighbor just like everyone else. And that's how things kind of go on from day to day. And so our case managers help people with that type of goals. The big thing about services is we will provide them ourselves, but better we'll connect people to community-based services. So we work with Brookline Mental Health, we work with local AA and NA communities to get people what they need. We work with food pantries. If they run out of money at the end of every month, we want to connect them to the local food pantry so they're not struggling with that, fuel assistance, anything that makes life work is what our case managers are all about with people. So just a little bit about the first. So this was our first building, as I said already. It's 28 units of lodging house housing, very traditional lodging house. Everything is shared. The living room, the kitchens, the bathrooms. Each person has their own room. This building, again, Betsy showed this building. This is 1754 Beacon Street. BIC purchased this building, to gain site control so that it wouldn't be lost to the condominium market. And then Pine Street bought it from BIC and redeveloped it. This was our first building with studio apartments. So in this building, there were 9 lodging house units and 5 studios. And the line for the studios was around the block. Because if you think about it, who really wants to share a bathroom with a whole bunch of different people? And wouldn't it be great to have your own kitchenette? So now going forward, what we're doing is either enhanced lodging house units with private baths and kitchenettes, or studios or 1-bedrooms. But we learned that lesson right here in Brookline at 1754 Beacon Street in this beautiful building. This is the Sarah Wallace house, as again Betsy mentioned, at 1017 Beacon Street. This was a big first for Pine Street in that we manage this for BIC. We do the property management and we provide the support services to the tenants living in here. We had never done that for anybody else. And so, social enterprise, kind of fireworks went off, like we can do this. We can do this for other agencies who might not want to, or might not have the expertise that our case management staff does in dealing with people that have some of the issues that come up when people are coming from shelter into housing. So we were thrilled that BIC had the confidence in us to let us manage this building, and we've gone on to manage for many other nonprofit organizations, mostly community development corporations in Boston and Chelsea. And so Beale Street is 2 side-by-side buildings. This is the building that's going to go under construction next. This is full of people right now. And this is the building. Betsy had that picture in her PowerPoint of the green building on the right. That's the completed building, and that's the before. And the wonderful thing about this building at 5557 Beals is that it's handicap accessible. So I don't know if you can see it. It's supposed to kind of blend in. It's got a lift on the right-hand side, that white door, and then the entire first floor of the building is accessible with 2 fully accessible units and a common space that's fully accessible. So we're very excited about that. This week, we received our certificate of occupancy for that building, and we're moving in this weekend. For this building, the Beale Street properties were full before we started the construction, so we had to do relocation of people. So the people who are going to move into 5557 were already there. They were already living at Beale Street. So demand-wise, I don't have a good number on that, but just to tell you, we have 2 other projects that are opening in February and this spring. One is 31 units in Jamaica Plain, and the other is 12 1-bedroom units in Dorchester. For both of those buildings, we have a pool of 600 people. For each of those projects, 600 people. And they're very specific. They're again, supportive housing, affordable. So the demand is just enormous. And I think that's it. Thank you.
All right, so that was a different view of affordable housing. And our final speaker is David Treach, chair of the Brookline Housing Authority, which is a sort of quasi-state. It has a relationship with the state government. It's a state authority. Okay, it is a state authority. Okay. But the important thing about the Housing Authority in particular is that they are the largest operator, manager of affordable housing units. With the new Dummer Street opening, there'll be about 950 fixed units, that is to say, units that the Housing Authority owns and operates, some for seniors, some for people with disabilities, some for families. But they also control a very important commodity called federal Section 8 vouchers, and I understand there are about 900 of those. Some of them you heard mentioned as site-based vouchers, which is to say some of the tenants who live in Pine Street Inn units have housing vouchers that they were able to receive through the Brookline Housing Authority. There are other buildings around town, some of them specific not-for-profit, let's call it housing, but run by not-for-profits, that also have Section 8 vouchers that they obtain through the Brookline Housing Authority. So it's a complicated set of responsibilities, partly the operating and management of housing, rental housing, and the allocation of the additional 900 Section 8 vouchers. David.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? I wanted to do three things, actually, in this conversation. I wanted to talk a little bit about the challenge. I wanted to tell you a bit about the BHA, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about strategies. So let me begin by asking, how many of you are homeowners in Brookline? Great. How many of you think your children could afford to buy a house in Brookline? God bless. Nice. Okay, for those of you who may only be watching me, if this is live anywhere, we had a lot of hands go up for homeowners, and we had one hand go up for somebody who thought their child might be able to buy a house in Brookline. This is, again, under the challenge thing. So the reason I ask that is that we know that nationally and in the state and in Brookline, that there are trends going on where we're getting polarized between people who are way up here and people who are down there in terms of what they can afford and their future of what they're looking at in terms of the ability to live the life they want to live. And if you need further proof of that, I didn't bring a slide for you, but as you leave the building tonight, as you leave Town Hall, if you look straight across the street, you'll see what looks like newly renovated housing. I don't know whether it's new construction or not, but there are 3 units there. And if you have $1.3 million, you can buy a 2-bedroom unit right across the street there. And it's a beautiful unit. You can see the photos on the internet, but it's $1.3 million. So don't run out now, but that's what's happening here in Brookline. And that's so I want to say it's a national thing, it's a local thing, it's happening in Brookline, and I wanted to make that point. So let me talk a little bit about what the Housing Authority does, and Betsy gave you a great intro. We house people who are of low income. And so about half of our units are families and half of our units are elderly, and their average incomes for elderly range typically between $10,000 and $20,000 a year. That's their average incomes. And for families, it's probably between $20,000 and $35,000 or $40,000 a year, depending on the number of kids that, well, and these are families that have 2, 3, 4, 5 children. And their ability to live in Brookline has to do with available public housing in most cases. And the thing that we talk about in the importance of the Housing Authority and the 1,000 units that we have is that when a family that otherwise could not afford to live in Brookline is given the opportunity to live in Brookline, it changes the trajectory of their family and the generations to come. Their kids all of a sudden can go to the Brookline school system. They have access to Steps to Success. They have access to Brookline Community Health and public health. They have access to our parks and our backup. They now have a very different future than they would have if they live in a different community. And so this is like something we provide that's way more than housing. And so that's the function. And one of the things that's great about the Brookline Housing Authority, and I can say that because I don't do the work, I'm just on the board, is that most of you don't know where all our units are. We have about 10 different developments and then some scattered site, and you probably don't know where they are. Or maybe you know one or two. I grew up in New Jersey, and when I grew up, you knew where the public housing was. Everybody knew where the public housing was. It's where your parents say, don't go to that neighborhood and don't go through that place. But in Brookline, there are neighbors. And in Brookline, their housing looks like our housing. And so they live here, and it's a real terrific thing that this town does in supporting us. We're a state agency, but a lot of what we do is in partnership with the town, with the state, with the federal government. We have lots of partners. For better or worse, they all have regulations that we live under, but we have lots of partners. Let me tell you about the new thing that we did, and Betsy mentioned it. Right now, over the last month or so, we opened the first new 32 units at Dummer Street, new construction, permanently affordable, same population profile, and that's going to be forever to that profile. We'll be living there. Again, 32 families worth of housing. We had 2,400 applications. 2,400 applications for 32 units of housing. Within the 32, we have 3 accessible units. We had 16 applications for those 3 units. 70% of the people moving into Dummer Street will be Brookline residents because that's what we're allowed to do, and we maximize that. 2 of those families will be from our units elsewhere because they should have the same opportunity. And if you have a chance to get over there and look at it, it's just a phenomenal project. And in fact, not only are the units wonderful, but we rebuilt the courtyard where there's a new playground, a new open area. And we did that in part because the new units deserve them. But one of the reasons we were able to do this development, this is for Brookline an easy development. Let me define easy. Took about 5 years, took 6 or 7 different funding sources, and we own the property around it. So all the abutters already live with us. They're our residents. Oh, and by the way, the one side that wasn't our residence that we own was Boston. And so you'll maybe get tired of hearing me saying that. All the shadow of the building falls on Boston. And all our permitting folks seem to really enjoy that, so I keep saying that. So that's, and Betsy wanted me to talk a little bit, and I will talk about this important thing about the Section 8 certificates. So we manage about 950 Section 8 certificates. These are federal certificates that for the most part go with the individual. The individual goes and finds an apartment, and the landlord has to say, yes, I will accept a Section 8 certificate. They then have to get certified. The apartment gets checked, and they then get that. However, the downside is the federal government's rate for what they will pay for a monthly rent is not up to the market in Brookline. And so most of our Section 8 certificates go outside of Brookline. They can go any place. And so while they're ours to manage, they're scattered throughout. The people who have the best chance of locating a Section 8 certificate in Brookline are 1 bedroom. So that's a little more comparable. So sometimes a landlord will trade the consistency and dependability of getting that check every month from the federal government and take a slightly lower rent. So we're good. We do that well. There's another subset of Section 8 certificates that I'll mention, and those are project-based. So again, you got a guarantee rate from the federal government. If you're a developer and you're looking to build new and you want to rent things out, but you're not sure you're going to have the income to make the project work, if we designate 8 or 10 Section 8 certificates to your project, they're now based in your project, they become a secure level of funding that you can count on. And so developers like that. So we've worked with the Pine Street Inn, we've worked with St. Aidan's, we've worked with most of the major affordable housing developments here to provide some of that. It's a great way to use the Section 8, place the people we want to place, and have them stay in Brookline. And that's what works. Okay? So that's the BHA. Oh, and by the way, I have to say, the thing that's really special about the BHA, other than our staff who are just wonderful, is the fact that we work in partnership in Brookline. So again, steps to success. I don't know if you know about the Steps of Success program. This is a national model. We start with 4th grade, and if you're a kid that comes from a household of low income, we will send a social worker to meet with you and a guidance counselor to meet with you and your family. And the whole thing about steps is to help you develop a trajectory that you will eventually go to college. We support you, we support your family, and when I say we, I say the town of Brookline is the we. Brookline Community Mental Health, our foundation, the teacher, the school department, it's just a whole network that supports that kid and that family and help them go, and the numbers are phenomenal in terms of who actually gets to college, goes through college. And every time this program gets a year older, we extend the program. So now we have people visiting our kids at college to help support them and so on. And I'm sure soon we'll do an employment thing for the kids who graduate. So now I want to talk, so that's the BHA, and that's what we do, and I'm sure there's a whole lot more we could talk about. But what I wanted to get to in just a few minutes was this whole thing about strategies. There are 2 strategies that I think come into play in terms of increasing affordable housing. The first one I think is to preserve what you have. And so I'm here to tell you, and here's the pitch, most of public housing was built in the 1940s and 1950s, and even though we get money to repair and keep upgrading it, not enough. Federal government will say they don't give us enough, the state doesn't give us enough, but we do the best we can. Some of those buildings are really running into their end of lifetime. You just can't. There are buildings where we replace mechanicals by going not to producers, but by antique stores. I'm serious. We will find electrical parts by going to people who collect old whatever. I'm not going to tell you what parts. But some of those buildings, not only are the systems at a point where they can't quite be replaced up to standard, but the size of the rooms, the size of the corridors, the bathroom-bedroom ratios, all of those no longer meet standards. And I'm telling you, there's going to come a point soon where we're going to need to reestablish those public housing units. It's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to be a big project. And here's the big issue that I mention every place I go, is that if you have 100 units of housing that were built in 1950, and you want to bring those units up to space standards, so the bedrooms are actually what are livable, not luxury, livable, you're going to increase the size of that building by about 30 to 50%. If you want to keep the same building envelope, you're going to reduce the number of units by 30 to 50%. So we have a challenge here because density is a big deal in Brookline. And height and all that is a big deal in Brookline. So we know that's going to be a challenge. So here's part of the answer. And this goes to the other strategy. The other strategy is we have to be innovators. We have to talk about smart growth. We need to talk about using our transportation network smartly so we don't have to have people have to have cars when they really don't need it. We need to look at mixed-use development. And quite frankly, there's one development that I'm sort of getting involved in a little bit that's at a very preliminary stage, and that's the development they're talking about at Kehilloth Israel in Coolidge Corner. That's a development that's in the middle of a commercial district where they're talking about a ground floor with some kind of a commercial use and housing above it for seniors. Seniors who don't need a lot of cars and a lot of parking, but have all the sort of benefits of the Coolidge Corner area. And again, Coolidge Corner, remember, we're always going to have a mix of students, we're always going to have a mix of young families, having a mix of seniors. This is a really ideal location. There's a real innovative project that I think is being talked about and is about to happen there. And so let's keep an eye on that. And let's not only support it, but use it as a model to see what we should be doing elsewhere in town. And so preservation, being innovative, whether it's zoning, whether it's how we apply. I mean, Roger really talked about the incredible talents we have in this building, the knowledge and skills we have in this building to use different sort of programs and come at housing in creative ways is tremendous. We have a great staff here. We have a couple of challenges, however. One is we have a strong neighborhood-based sort of political system here. And right now, if you ask me, do we have an equal strong neighborhood base and a community-wide perspective, I think we might be a little bit out of balance. I'm being polite. I think that needs to be rebalanced. I think we need to have entities that think strategically town-wide what's best for the town, and we need to have strong neighborhood entities, and there needs to be give and take on both. And if we do that and we have the political will, I think there's a lot of interesting things we can do in this town. It's a great place. Thank you.
My name is Ann Lusk. I live at 18 Hart Street in Brookline. I have a PhD in architecture. I work on bicycle research, and I work at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. So if you wonder how I came to affordable housing, if you connect all three of those, you'll understand my question. I recently did research in Roxbury, asking people about bicycling, including bicycle parking. Because low-income people are nervous that their bicycle, their form of transportation, will be stolen, many of them are carrying bicycles up 3 flights of stairs to park their bikes inside their individual housing unit. They don't want to park a bike in a communal space because if your saddle's stolen, your pedals are stolen, you then don't have your form of transportation. Because you have been progressive tonight and you're really willing to look at innovative ideas, all I want to be able to do is email all 4 of you and suggest this idea to explore creating in housing unit bicycle parking so that a parent with a child on the back of the bike could wheel inside the housing unit, drop the child off the back of the bike, the child runs into the kitchen, you take the groceries off, and there you are. I've already done research in Pine Street Inn, and the residents there were extremely responsive to biking because it's their form of transportation. Second progressive idea. Because I look at cycle tracks, which are very protected bicycle facilities on the side of the road, I also study car parking. I also live in an 1820 workman's cottage in Brookline, and I don't have a parking space because back then you had horses and carriages and maybe the shuttle, the T. Parking my car is very difficult. It means that I have to pay rent somewhere to park my car, and as the seniors in my neighborhood, Whiskey Point, which I will proudly call Whiskey Point, are not continuing to live there, they're passing on, then the availability of car parking for people like me in, let's say, the brownstones is becoming a very limited resource. So I've talked to many people in affordable housing, including HUD, about funding affordable housing by selling individual parking spaces to area residents as a new novel way to then fund affordable housing and also to win the allegiance of the neighbors in that neighborhood because they then would be getting a benefit, which is getting cars off the street. And I suggest off the street because even if you have overnight parking, you still put your car back on the road. So all I'm asking is if I could email all 4 of you with these 2 ideas. 1 is putting bike parking inside an individual unit, and 2, funding the affordable housing by car parking and selling those parking spaces to area residents, then I'd be appreciative.
I'm going to suggest you email them to me, and I'll forward it to
Betsy,
them. Okay?
Yes, I do that all the time. She knows.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Could I just
Sure.
respond?
Go ahead.
Just
Yeah.
one thing that I thought was really unique in the town is when we developed 1754 Beacon, as part of the cash flow for the project, the town required us to lease one of the spaces in the back of the building to a neighbor. And it's worked out, it's been great.
As we know, on Beacon Hill, there was the 1 parking space that was available for sale for $650,000.
Right.
It would have operated similar to a condo. There were other units that are outside on the ground for $350,000. So there is a resale value, and it's better if you don't have to rent, if you can actually own the unit, because then your housing unit appreciates in value. If you can say, I also have a deeded space that is my own, that then goes with the house. And you identify your zone around your affordable housing and then sell units only to those people.
Excuse me, quick question. Who plows the space if you own it?
It would be similar to a condo association in that it would be a communal plowing, and you would pay a condo association maintenance fee.
I'm Frank Caro. Among other things, I'm involved with the Brookline Community Aging Network and the Brookline Age Friendly City Initiative. I would welcome some discussion explicitly about affordable housing for seniors. And I say that, would like you to talk about that for a couple of reasons. One is we have a rapidly expanding senior population, and we're going to have that going forward. Aging baby boomers who are now entering old age are our most rapidly growing sector of the Brookline population in the last decade. That group, some of who are represented in this room, grew by 40%. That going forward, that's going to be a huge need. And the other side of it is that from a Brookline point of view, this is a relatively attractive population to serve because they mostly don't have school children, and so from a town's cost point of view, the costs are relatively modest. They also, if they are housed close to public transportation, they need less parking. So there are kind of lots of reasons to kind of look at that as a relatively attractive population to serve. So I would just appreciate some discussion explicitly about possibilities for expanding affordable housing for seniors.
Comments?
Well, thank you, Frank. And I think that your efforts for CAN and age-friendly cities is much appreciated by seniors in general. A couple of just two very different kinds of responses. I think when we think of senior housing, we tend to think of multifamily housing that's age-restricted. But there's another kind of housing that is, there's a lot of in Brookline that's pretty invisible, but we might be well advised to consider formalizing this a bit more, and that's what's known as accessory dwelling units. There are a lot of reasons why existing homeowners and potentially senior renters can benefit at the advancing stages of their life for having access to accessory units in existing homes. That type of housing, while it benefits seniors, is not strictly affordable housing as it's kind of formally defined, because typically it's not deed restricted or income restricted, but it does meet a growing need in Brookline, and it's something that I think warrants a closer look by anybody who's advocating for seniors in that regard. Regarding age-restricted or senior housing in general, what we know is senior housing, I think it's timely. I mentioned the process that's about to begin, the housing production report. The first phase of that roughly 6 months effort is actually going to be a housing needs evaluation, a housing needs study, including our steering group and our consultant. So I think that we should probably have some intentional dialogue to make sure that the needs of seniors are properly identified and captured in that exercise that we're about to undertake. I might add that while the prior effort to formalize zoning that recognizes accessory units in Brookline, and this is something that AARP, for example, is advocating nationally, while that did not succeed from a zoning standpoint, one thing that the Housing Advisory Board and staff did in cooperation with the building department and the health department was to develop a short brief, which is posted on the town website and under the Planning Community Development Department. It's a description of what homeowners who are concerned about aging in place and having suitable housing for the next stages of their life, things that they can do under existing town regulations to make their home more suitable for themselves or possibly extended family in terms of in-law or extended family living. So I'd invite anybody that's interested in that particular subject to have a look at it.
If I could, Frank, I just lost you. Where there you are. I want to thank you for bringing that up. The two trends also that I want to add to what you've contributed is the fact of the matter that with increased longevity, we're all living longer, and all the statistics say that most of us are not prepared financially to continue to live in accordance with our current standard of living. People just don't have money saved for the additional length of time. And so not only do I think we have more seniors, but I think it's a growing vulnerable population. And this trend towards the whole idea of living in place, I think, is hopefully giving way to what I think is a healthier trend, which is living in community, which is maintaining those social connections and the service connections you need so you can have an active senior life. And I think that when you give people an opportunity to go from living in a large structure that where you're overhoused but isolated into living in a more appropriate structure where you're connected to services and relationships, not only is it good for you, but it frees up housing stock for next generations to come and take advantage of living in this town.
Just one other quick thing in terms of our housing goals and moving towards our 10% with new housing production. Clearly, from the town's fiscal standpoint, other than meeting the needs of seniors, there's a clear fiscal advantage to the extent that our production is directed at seniors. I see Henry Winkleman in the audience here, and I'd be remiss if I didn't fail to mention the fact that there's another town study besides the housing production plan that's about to be undertaken, has to do with the major sites that are owned or controlled by the town. And one idea that would seem to have some merit is on one or more of the town-owned parking lots to retain the parking, but to develop senior housing, and most likely it would be rental housing, which has some very major advantages in terms of the 40B rules. In locations that are very much meeting of seniors' needs to have walkable surroundings and nearby commercial facilities. So I think that's something to keep an eye on.
I'll just add that, and I think I sort of touched on this a little bit in my presentation, but there's nothing incompatible necessarily with age-restricted housing or senior housing in Chapter 40R, except in situations where you had maybe a very small district that was limited to one parcel or project. And I also would just mention, in addition to sort of the friendly 40B, or a local initiative program type comprehensive permit, there's also something called local action units, which is essentially a way to get municipally permitted affordable units counted on the subsidized housing inventory, and that's another perhaps in some cases more flexible tool if there's a specific type of housing that's desired.
Okay, next question, and you're going to have to pull that mic down a little bit so you'll be heard.
Story of my life.
Right.
Okay. My name is Susan Granoff, and like Frank, I'm active on Brookline CAN's advocacy committee. And I've also done work directly with seniors who are living in Brookline Housing Authority's senior housing. So I have 3 brief comments. My question was kind of answered before I even asked it, which was, could the town take over the air rights above our parking lots and build senior housing there? And so I'm very happy that that's being considered, because I think it's a wonderful way of perhaps reaching that 10% mark that we're striving for. The second point, I wanted to just reiterate what David said at the beginning of his remarks, which is that there's some wonderful programs that we've heard about to enable lower income people to live in Brookline. And we all know that with property values going up the way they are, there's no problem about the wealthier class of people living in Brookline. But my concern is that Brookline may very well lose the true middle class. And because the middle class people don't qualify for any of the programs that we've discussed tonight. So my question is, is any concern or consideration being given to helping middle-class people stay in Brookline, or are we no longer going to be a truly diverse economic community?
Well, one thing that addresses that, any production is always very limited relative to the demand, but Brookline has always tried to do things that it feels is best for the community, and not just because the state has certain prescribed categories. And an example of that is that Chapter 40B only recognizes for affordable housing credit people who earn less than 80% of the area median income, not just Brookline's. And that's good to meet those needs, but it almost artificially segregates the full market rate housing and this huge affordability gap between. We've consciously tried to keep at least a sense of middle income housing on the table, for example, at Olmsted Hill, to have different mixed incomes and not just under 80. You've got 80 to 100, 110. That doesn't close the affordable gap entirely, but it goes up and gives us some diversity in that sense. It was a little disappointing that the original plan for St. Aidan's also included a full range of mixed incomes, and as the cost of the project went up and then there was delays in litigation, some of us were disappointed that that targeted middle income group and those additional units were lost to the financial feasibility numbers. But that's, I think, one way of looking at it.
Yeah, I would just add that, I mean, that's certainly something we talk about a lot at the state, and it's a challenge. There's certainly, obviously nothing with 40R or necessarily with 40B that would, or friendly 40B anyway, prevent a community from putting in a requirement at those thresholds. But admittedly, there's no, at this point, really state incentive for that. There is, the Community Preservation Act, which allows for higher income thresholds, but that I don't believe is available in Brookline.
But I think it's important to remember that we talked about the complexity of the funding for most of these development projects, and oftentimes the source of the funding will define income eligibility. So to the extent that the town has the flexibility to try to create these higher eligibility levels, the challenge is still to find the package of funding that will allow us to do it.
Brookline's inclusionary zoning is interesting in that regard, because that's a locally grown concept that's been working for 20 years and has been creating affordable housing, not in huge numbers, but in several dozen different properties. And it's probably worth noting there that bylaw, unlike the state's more rigid formula, calls for 2/3 of the town-grown affordable units under inclusionary zoning to be under 80 and allows 1/3 to be over 80.
Okay. And then the third comment that I had was actually on a state program that used to be very helpful to preserving a middle-class base in Brookline, but is no longer really being able to be utilized, and that is the circuit breaker tax break. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that, but there's a two-part requirement to enable taxpayers to get approximately a little over $1,000 off of their state taxes to compensate them for real estate taxes that they pay. They have to meet income requirements, and their property has to meet a cutoff point in valuation. Now, what that has meant for Brookline residents, in a place where our property values have been going up in the last 3 years, probably about 20%, but at the same time, property values throughout the state, particularly in the western part of the state, have been declining precipitously. So over the last 3-4 years, the cutoff valuation for property has actually been decreasing on this CD, circuit breaker, tax break. 3 years ago, it was, I believe, around 720,000 or 714,000. Currently, it's about 690,000. So while the property values are going up, fewer and fewer of Brookline residents can actually take advantage of that break, no matter how minimal their income is. And there, at one point, we thought, well, maybe it should be on a county basis as opposed to estimating.
This is sounding to me like state legislation, not
Right.
local municipal. I'm sorry to cut you off, but there are other people waiting, and we're going to run out of time.
If people could do something to put more of the state representatives and senators on notice that this, if they could eliminate the property valuation part of it, that would enable more of the senior citizens in Brookline who purchased property 20 and 30 years ago, but whose income is now very modest, to afford to stay here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next speaker.
Good evening. I really appreciate the participation that you have all brought to the panel. It's been very informative and helpful, and I'm grateful to the League of Women Voters for making this one of their subjects of the year. I have one comment and then a couple of questions. Roger Blood had indicated what some of the challenges are, and he talked about competitive interests in the land and referred to schools and commercial development. I just want to add to that open space, where we have a lot of density in Brookline. Open space is really a critical need as well. Question. I have been hearing that because we are approaching the 10% requirement of affordable housing in order to not be subject to 40B developments that we might not welcome, that we can look forward to kind of a deluge of 40B proposals as people try to get in under the 10% requirement. And so my question is there a way in which the town can add an overlay of requirement to any 40B project? If a 40B project now requires, I believe, Bill, you were saying 20%, 25% for senior as a proportion of the units that need to be affordable, could we, I'm aware, for example, of a new development in Boston, which is 1/3 low income, 1/3 affordable, and 1/3 market. And I'm wondering whether it is possible for the town to put that kind of overlay on any further 40B projects.
One thing that I love about the Housing Advisory Board is its embarrassment of riches as far as expertise in not only affordable housing but 40B, and I'm going to ask one of my colleagues if he might give you a more expert answer on that. I think the simple answer is no, but Mike Jacobs can probably give you a little flesh around that bone if he's able.
Oh, and I don't know, Bill, you might have something you want to say too, right?
Well, I could just, there was some conflating, I think, of a little bit of 40R
Come on
and 40B
forward. I'm
there.
not stopping you. I'm just filling time.
Just with 40R, I suppose you could, it's local zoning. It has to meet, so you have to meet that 20% at 80. But a community, and DHCD is charged with making sure that the zoning is feasible. So we have had communities who have thrown out the idea of 30% affordability rather than 25. It never really came to a fruition where we had to make a determination on that because locally they just decided at the end of the day to do 25. But it's certainly possible to propose that in the zoning.
Okay.
And if Mr. Jacobs would like to come and give us some more?
Under 40B at this point in time, a community can propose that, but it would not be approved. There are certain programs which you're allowed to apply under 40B, and you have to follow those programs through a subsidizing agency. So if the subsidizing agency says the program minimum is 20% or 25%, a town can't impose a higher affordability requirement. The subsidizing agency or the Housing Appeals Committee, which ultimately a developer can appeal to, would simply throw that out. So that's not something a town can impose.
That's disappointing.
And I'm going to ask you to be focused because we do have another person to speak at
Yes.
least, and we're going to run out of time.
Right. Well, my next question relates to costs. And I'm on the board of BIC. I'm very happy that one of the town's best-kept secrets got some attention this evening. But our challenge at this point is, especially when it comes to finding properties and rehabbing them, is the cost and being able to move quickly enough, which makes me a little curious about how long Pine Street Inn has owned Beale Street properties, because I would have thought that those would have been terrifically expensive.
Well, I'll be really quick. That is just a wonderful town story. So like 10 years ago, the town sent out a letter to every lodging house owner and said, if you are even thinking about selling, please call the Community Development Department. And the Schultz family, who owned the side-by-side Beale's properties, did. The town introed us, and then we managed that building, those two buildings, for 8 years. We set up an agreement with the Schultz family, and on Mrs. Schultz's death, we had the option to purchase the two buildings. And Mrs. Schultz was in her mid-90s when we signed the agreement, and she lived to be 103. And so we managed the buildings for 8 years very successfully. It worked for Mrs. Schultz and her family economically, and it worked for the Pine Street Inn. And then we had the option to purchase. So it was a very unique situation.
Well, I'm just wondering if at some point there isn't going to be a need for doing some public fundraising, or, I mean, like BIC is a nonprofit, and should we be looking at fundraising so that we do have the funds that are needed if we need to move quickly, more quickly than a developer, who always gets there before we do? It's a challenge.
One of the beauties of the town's housing trust fund, the outgrowth of inclusionary zoning, not being subject to state rules and regulations, is that it has been used very effectively, not just for long-term write-downs to reduce the costs of producing affordable housing, but as a vehicle for exactly what we're talking about here, moving in and capturing control of a property just long enough so that it isn't exposed to the much higher market prices that sellers are tempted to take. That's been done several times. So there is at least that one funding source that has that potential.
We'd like to be your partner.
Yes,
Thank you.
and we have been.
Next person, come forward. Nope. She's
evening.
directing.
Doing very well, I'd say. My name is Michael Kim. I am a Brookline architect. I also happen to be the co-chair of the Multifamily Council at the Home Builders Association of Greater Boston. My question, with a little background, when a development of almost any size beyond, say, 3 units, actually 6, I think, is built, there's an affordable component, which most often, and the most often vehicle used is to have an affordable unit or two or whatever percentage in that development. And I've been involved in projects that actually put affordable units on golf courses, on waterfronts, and it always strikes me that the one thing that all new housing has in common, no matter built for what use, is that they're really expensive. And it seems we're working against the market and against the entire industry to place affordable housing in new buildings. Brookline, somewhat less than other communities, but still has a wealth of older, decent, but less attractive buildings that could be used for housing, and they are more affordable. Tonight was, in fact, the first time I've heard of the very small programs we have where there's essentially a linkage, where developers can buy into a fund rather than placing those affordable units in their developments. How can we make the common sense of making used housing, affordable housing, the same thing that most of us who are not in the wealthy or the very poor, the middle class, choose to do? We buy used housing because it's what we can afford. Yes, the roof has to be replaced in 10 years, the kitchen may not be the best, but it is affordable. Why don't we have that vehicle in our...
We do.
Okay.
We do. I think the town has tried to strike a balance in that regard, and I think I can give you a good example of that. And in the toolkit I mentioned, it's there, and we could do it again. The skills and the funds are there. When the original Longyear estate was redeveloped, and it was subject to inclusionary zoning. I'm not talking about Olmsted Hill now, but the prior one at Longyear. And the bylaw at that time required on-site units and totally comparable. So had it been just done blindly, we would have had maybe 5 or 6 units of $1 million or $2 million going to some, winners of the most gigantic lottery in an affordable housing sense, to get multi-million-dollar units. So the bylaw was modified, and in a way that I think you might approve of, whereby the developer was able to make, there were 2 options. One is off-site development of housing, and the other is a contribution to the Affordable Trust Fund, where we can take that money and leverage it up, which you can't do with on-site housing, bring in additional resources. The upshot of that was we got, instead of 5 or 6 units, we got, I think, 14 or 15 total units, one of which was the acquisition of a double 3-decker for family housing, and which was renovated with these resources by the private developer, and then resold through a lottery, and it's still very successful today in Chestnut Hill. Another part of the resources that were moved off of these multi-million luxury units enabled the financing of a lodging house, one of the lodging houses on Upper Beacon Street. So we ended up not only greatly increasing the number of units, affordable units that came out, but we were able to serve diverse populations in existing housing and making it permanently affordable. So I think that we would be thrilled if that kind of opportunity came along again, and the regulations and the resources and the know-how are there to do it.
And I would say, I think the town is very open to using whatever leverage influence the town has to think about those kinds of things in a creative way.
Well, we'd certainly like to help you with that. I congratulate you for that. It's just that very few people in the industry know that that exists. And in fact, until tonight, I didn't know it existed in Brookline.
And there are conflicting views that I think Brookline has had to reconcile in that regard. It's, not everybody sees what I just described to you as an ideal solution, because and much of the housing is done on site because it has inherent advantages of having mixed income and diversity in a particular project. So we're set up now to do both and try to do the best of both.
Well, sometimes what you're doing is you're asking a developer with experience in new construction to get into the rehab business. So there's pros and cons on both sides of it. But again, we've got the tools.
Thank you.
Hi, Carol. My question is for David. David, in your presentation, you raised something which I found very alarming, and that has to do with modernizing the public housing that now exists in Brookline. How will that be financed? Is that a federal government finance? Is that local? I mean, how could something like that be done?
Yeah, I said there was a need, and that's what we're looking at. I didn't say we've got the financing figured out, but part of the problem actually is we've now had decades of being underfunded for capital repairs for public housing, and so it's just a huge gap there. We did a survey about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago where we had somebody come in and look at all our properties and get a cost as to what it would take to bring them all up to standard. We had something like a $30 million bill there.
But whose responsibility would it be to come up with the $30 million?
It would be ours.
Ours meaning local.
Well, I'm a commissioner in the Brookline Housing Authority, and we have the responsibility for the upkeep and running of those developments. And
But
quite
the sources are usually public funds, I think, maybe.
You go, it's why Dillinger robbed banks. You'd have to go where the money is, and the money would either be the federal government or the private market. To go to the private market, you have to create a different kind of public housing configuration. That's not pure public housing. So you have to be creative. But we were creative at Dummer Street. Right. And so we have a mix of financing that made that project doable, and a commitment and a restriction that the people housed there would be the same profile as the people housed in our...
I understand Dummer Street, which by the way is wonderful.
Thank you.
Is that it's something new, but to finance improvements of something old is always much harder.
Yes. All the easy stuff's been done.
Right.
Right, but...
So what are you going to do?
Right. But one of the things that we really can't talk about now because we don't have enough time, but one of the kinds of possibilities is something that would be redevelopment. And that might give us an opportunity to do, and it would depend on many, many complicated factors, but if we were to take some of the 40 R&S concepts and think about mixed use as opposed to strictly housing operated by the housing authority in its own sort of island, okay? You got to make a leap there to get to that kind of solution, but those are things that we should be discussing as we go forward, in my humble opinion.
Thank you.
That's
Yeah, sorry.
May I just go back
Roger.
very quickly to Marilisa's comment? I think it's worth picking up for just a moment on your remark about open space, which is a fourth competing use for sure. It I think raises an interesting question of what should affordable housing advocates do or not do. I remember, this is a while back, that from that advocacy standpoint, an idea was floated that a way to produce affordable housing at a reasonable cost would be to reduce Putterham Golf Course from 18 holes to 9 holes and build affordable housing up and down all of the greenways. What's a proper place for affordable housing advocates to advocate, and do we leave that for the green space advocates to come and argue the other side, or do we hold back and say that's a bit too far? So it does raise an interesting point about competing uses and advocacy.
Could I respond to that? That we need to build coalitions. Right. We don't need to build divisive competition. This is about growing the pie, not splitting too small a pie. I'll use whatever metaphors I can think of. But we don't want to fight here. We want to build coalitions. Green space, affordable housing should not suffer because of green space and vice versa. And the thing that I want to mention about affordable housing, if building affordable housing in any way lowers the property values of the surrounding neighborhood or in any way denigrates the surrounding neighborhood, it shouldn't be done. Should not be done. It needs to be a positive contribution. So, quite frankly, I'm not all that fixated on 10%. What I'm fixated is how we're going to build housing, how are we going to build homes for people that are going to be part of our community and can stay in our community going to the forward.
Yeah, 10% is it's a production goal, but it's a very much of the second dimension is it's a bogey for where we can then have some say about protecting our neighborhoods if we reach the 10%. And the interest is very much blended.
Right. And I would say, in fairness, Brookline's initiatives around affordable housing have, one, created permanently deed-restricted affordability, and two, had the flexibility to offer higher income eligibility levels and things like that, none of which are possible under 40B, but 40B, unfortunately, seems to drive, let me say, drives the process because it kind of overrides local zoning, and because of that can often occur at a larger scale than is feasible using local resources. So it's
a special thank you tonight to Betsy DeWitt for pulling together this program and for moderating it. And a very big thank you to the panel for bringing us a great deal of information on many different aspects of the big issues of affordable housing. This is a conversation that will surely go on for a good long time in Brookline, and there are people in this room who share and then have many different experiences and concerns about the issue of affordability in housing. Thank you to those people in the audience who raised some of those concerns with us here tonight. As we go on with the conversation, the League of Women Voters will next have a discussion this Friday morning. We do, on the second Friday of every month, an informal coffee gathering at Panera's at 9:30. People in the room are welcome to join us if you can. And the topics from tonight's program will be on our discussion list for Friday morning. So thank you very much to everybody for joining us tonight. Join us, if you will, on Friday. We hope some of you in the room will consider joining us also as members of the League of Women Voters. Thank you.